A chapter of human memory had been folded into clay and buried beneath centuries of river silt. In the dry light of the Euphrates plain, the city of Uruk rose like a promise in mudbrick and baked clay. Walls that once stretched for miles, a temple terrace that caught the morning sun, courtyards scented with date palm sap and smoke. The great city kept its stories the way a hand keeps a scar, embedded, familiar, and unread until someone brushed away the earth and found the marks beneath. If you stay with this account until the end, you'll find how those marks knit together myth, archaeology, and modern speculation. If it moves you, like the video, subscribe for more reconstructions, and tell us in the comments where you first heard of Gilgamesh or the Anunnaki, place and time. Your comment helps map how these stories travel. Archaeology begins as a series of small, stubborn facts. The mound that we call Warka covers hectares of ancient habitation. Excavators in the early 20th century measured walls whose foundations suggest defensive lines and civic ambition. Sections of baked brick rampart that, when extrapolated from surviving traces, imply a perimeter of many kilometers, enclosing a dense urban grid. Beveled rim bowls and thousands of clay tokens show administrative techniques. Mass-produced vessels for rations, cylinder seals used to verify ownership, and administrative tablets folded like modern receipts. The tablets survived because the city itself fired them. Accidental conflagrations baked damp clay into enduring record. The smell of those tablets, when handled in a museum, is faintly of dust and the mineral tang of baked earth. The score of characters pressed into them, simple signs, and later cuneiform syllabary, read as bureaucratic scaffolding and as the scaffolding of story. Among these tablets were versions of a narrative later collected as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The name of the city, its kings, and a tragedy of friendship are carved into the same medium that recorded grain allocations and hymn lists. This contiguity, economy, and elegy on the same clay makes a particular kind of historical reading possible. Myths do not float free of material life. They grow inside it. The modern recovery of those tablets reads like a detective plot. In the mid-19th century, excavations and the gathering of cuneiform tablets from sites across Mesopotamia sent shivers through the emerging discipline of Assyriology. In a room in London, a small translation of a fragment pulled from Nineveh made an unmistakable claim. A man had set out to find the edge of mortality. He had crossed sacred mountains, felled a monstrous guardian, and wept by the river. George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working with the British Museum, read aloud what he called the Flood Tablet in 1872, and in the moment presented a story that reappeared in the cultural imagination with uncanny echoes of other flood traditions. Some researchers report concentrations of unusual materials at these boundaries: microtectites, nanodiamonds, platinum group element anomalies. Catastrophist authors, and some geologists, interpret these as markers of an extraterrestrial impact or airburst that triggered rapid climate fluctuations. Randall Carlson and a few others frame the evidence as suggestive of a terrifying continent-scale event that would have reconfigured human societies. Mainstream scholarship treats that conclusion with caution. Some labs replicate certain anomalous signals while others do not. The presence of platinum or other elements in a layer can arise from terrestrial processes as well. The field is unsettled.
What is not unsettled is the global signature of sudden environmental stress near the late Pleistocene-Holocene transition. Reworked soils, changes in vegetation, and abrupt shifts in resource availability would have been felt in settled and mobile communities alike. Whether the trigger was an impactor, a cascade of volcanic events, or regional shifts in ocean circulation, the archaeological record records response. Sites abandoned, technological adjustments, and new mythic language forming around water, darkness, and the sky. It is in that breach between recorded catastrophe and remembered myth that modern reinterpretations take root. Zachariah Sitchin, writing in the late 20th century, offered a narrative that reimagined Sumerian gods as extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru. He translated particular Sumerian terms in idiosyncratic ways and suggested that the Anunnaki were visitors who engineered human labor for mining. Sitchin's books have been enormously influential in alternative history circles because they provide a coherent story. Ancient builders, forbidden technology, a cosmic pendulum returning every 3,600 years. But Sitchin's philology and astronomical claims find little support in academic review. Linguists point out that he frequently conflates different sign values and selectively reads poetic metaphors as technical description. Astronomers note that a planetary orbit ascribed to Nibiru is dynamically implausible. A body on a 3,600-year eccentric orbit would likely have been detected by now, and would destabilize the inner solar system. When proponents claim otherwise, mainstream rebuttal directs attention to observable evidence, surveyed sky, orbital mechanics, and the absence of such perturbations in planetary motion. This pattern recurs. A fragment of ancient text offers a story. A charismatic interpreter offers an expansive reading that ties together mythology, catastrophe, and suppressed technology. Enthusiastic publics fill the gaps with speculation. The psychological appeal is clear. Catastrophe grants narrative stakes. Unknowns invite alternative answers. A threadbare human instinct to connect dots in a way that restores agency to contingency makes such theories attractive.
Responsible investigation, by contrast, tends to be patient. It asks about stratigraphy, radiocarbon ranges, and the philological choices made in translation. It keeps track of how hypothesis becomes narrative, and how narrative becomes cultural phenomenon. In the heart of the Epic of Gilgamesh is a moment that feels more like human testimony than cosmic allegory. After 1,000 efforts to find a way to live beyond death, Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, learns the story of the flood, and is given, and then fails, the test of immortality. The epic's language on this point is stark. Grief and acceptance are not resolved by secrets or stolen devices, but by domestic labor and civic legacy. "You will not find everlasting life," the old man tells him in paraphrase. Gilgamesh returns to his city. The tablets that bear his name turn the narrative into a public monument. In Uruk, the walls stand as measures of a life that resists oblivion. To the modern ear, that returns the conversation to a different register. If the search for cosmic rescue, through gods or aliens, fails, what remains is craft, law, and story. That thought has been reframed by advocates of a lost advanced civilization. Authors who suggest that episodic cataclysms, punctuated by global knowledge transfers, could explain sudden leaps in urbanism, metallurgy, and astronomical precision. The archaeological record offers case studies, but not a neat proof. Uruk's urbanism, population estimates in the tens of thousands at its height, monumental ziggurats, and the bureaucratic explosion visible in accounting forms, indicates a leap in social complexity. But the leap is traceable in steps: agricultural intensification, trade networks, and technical specialization visible in ceramics, metallurgy, and standardized weights.
There is no recovered hardware that unambiguously indicates a prior technologically superior civilization wiped clean by flood. There are, however, durable media of memory, clay tablets, cylinder seals, and architectural plans that reveal transmission, adaptation, and human ingenuity. The Anunnaki, as a group of powerful deities in Sumerian cosmology, operate within literary frames that explain misfortune, plague, and prosperity. In the myths, Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ishtar, and their kin argue, decree, and interact with humans as mechanisms of meaning. The me, in Sumerian thought, principles of civilization like kingship, writing, or musical skill are distributed among gods and humans, often transferred through mythic negotiation. A literalist reading treats those as divine patents. A more contextual reading sees them as cultural metaphors for institutions. Both treatments say something about human psychology. People project agency beyond themselves to explain the origins of complex social practices that require trust and coordination. When modern investigators dramatize the last Anunnaki king, a phrase that circles both myth and imagination, they bundle several impulses.
One is the archaeological impulse towards specificity. Can we identify a ruler whose reign correlates with a major environmental shock? Another is the mythic longing for continuity. Can a single figure stand for the transition from an older order to a new one? A historian would answer with nuance. King lists reveal reigns and dynasties. They compress and sometimes conflagrate names. Some names on those lists are deified ancestors or quasi-mythic figures. Others are clearly historical monarchs whose monuments and administrative residues persist. The last Anunnaki king, if posited as historical, becomes an interpretive device, a hinge between remembered divinity and recorded kingship. Consider an imagined scene composed from the epic and the material record, acknowledged as dramatization. Gilgamesh sits at dusk on the parapet of Uruk's wall. The bricks beneath his hands are warm from the day. He runs his fingers across lines of mortar worn by 1,000 sandals. He speaks not to the gods in the traditional summons, but to the city itself. If walls make memory, then let memory be my work. Enkidu, now gone, is a gap at the table. The courtyard smells of boiled lentils and date wine. A child plays with a clay disc, stamping it to look like a seal. This compression is not a literal retelling found on a single tablet. It is an interpretive rendering of the epic's emotional logic made to bridge archaeological texture and human feeling. That human feeling is essential when we turn to the modern discovery narrative. When George Smith lifted a fragment and read lines that resonated with the biblical flood, the reaction was not only academic curiosity, it was visceral recognition. The past presented itself as familiar, and the familiar demanded explanation. Over the next century and a half, successive waves of discovery, the rescue excavations, the decipherment of administrative archives, the cataloging of royal inscriptions, added granularity. Each inscription, each cylinder seal, each painstaking stratigraphic note acted like a pixel in a slowly rendering image of the ancient world. In parallel, catastrophe science pushed outward on a different axis. Marine cores, Greenland and Antarctic ice layers, and lacustrine deposits in the Near East record pulses of dust and shifts in isotopic composition. Kit samples from tell layers show abrupt abandonment events. Radiocarbon dating places some pulses close to the narrative horizon that mythmakers later reworked. Proponents of an impact-based Younger Dryas hypothesis assemble these proxies into a narrative of abrupt change. Critics emphasize the variability of proxies and the need for replication. Both camps meet at a shared point. Catastrophic physical events, whether sudden or protracted, make excellent seeds for myth.
The tension between rigorous correlation and seductive narrative forms the investigative heart of the story of the Anunnaki and of the last king.
The other follows the imagination that reconstructs what a last Anunnaki king might mean culturally and psychologically, the figure who bridges divine claim and civic responsibility, who presides over a world where gods are close enough to be negotiated with, and where disasters are recorded in complaint and hymn. Both are necessary. Both must be held in balance. We will next move deeper into the textual corpus, to the Atrahasis tradition, and to the particular tablets that frame gods as reluctant makers of labor, to the lexical choices that have been read as literal instruction and as rhetorical device. We will place Sitchin's philological choices under the lamp of comparative linguistics, and then set that analysis beside the geological record, so that the story remains tethered both to clay and to core. For now, the baked tablets sit in their drawers, unspooling a past that is stubbornly human, implacably material, and forever open to interpretation. The Atrahasis sequence, once set before us, resists both the comfortable reduction of myth into mere allegory and the eager inflation of myth into literal blueprint. Its opening lines establish a world already organized by divine house and duty. The great gods hold court, and the lesser gods perform the labor. It is a politics of work, framed as cosmic necessity. When the Igigi, those sky servants, rise and refuse to labor, the tale moves quickly to the problem solver of the pantheon, how to relieve the gods of the quotidian burdens that keep the cosmos running. From this problem comes the solution most readers have heard in outline: the fashioning of humans to carry burdens, to bear bricks, to dredge canals, and carry offerings. The sequence culminates in familiar retellings, in a flood that recalibrates the relationship between maker and made. Read closely, line by line, the tablets reveal a far more ambiguous texture than popular retellings suggest. Verbs that English translations render as made, fashioned, or assembled sit beside verbs of appointing and assigning. Passages that appear to describe blood and clay as raw material can be read philologically as ritualized formulas about life force and dependency, not technological manuals. Every lexical choice matters. A single Akkadian verb can carry an administrative sense in one corpus and a ritual sense in another. A Sumerian compound may be idiomatic, where a literal-minded reading creates a scaffold for speculation. This is basic comparative philology, and it is precisely what separates cautious scholarship from the reaches of what we might call speculative reconstruction. Sitchin's line-by-line deviations are instructive. He often favors readings that collapse ritual language into operational description. Where the canonical translation offers "the gods were in grief" and an Akkadian idiom suggests ritual lamentation, Sitchin hears the engineers wail and posits a program of genetic manufacture. Where an administrative list records rations and bricks, he sees encoded blueprints. To be clear, one can practice vigorous reinterpretation, and one can practice error. The distinction is whether a reinterpretation obeys the internal logic of the language, whether it accounts for parallel usages elsewhere, and whether it can be held up to non-linguistic tests: archaeological, material, astronomical. Take, for example, the tablets that list captive labor, temple offerings, and allocations of barley and oil.
They are not merely dry accounts. They are the substrate of a bureaucratic world in which labor is measured, distributed, and ritualized. That same milieu produces hymns that anthropomorphize public works as cosmic acts. The leap from the gods' assigned labor to the gods' programmed genetic automata skips several methodological stations. We do not deny the human capacity for sophisticated craft in the Bronze Age. Far from it. What we have in abundance are specialists, organized corvée systems, canal works requiring planning and workforce management, and the slow accumulation of technical skill transmitted across generations. We do not have, at any archaeological site so far, artifacts or structures that demand the existence of a technology for molecular manipulation. The geological record, meanwhile, offers its own language of constraint. The presence of anomalous platinum group elements in a given stratum catches attention because platinum is uncommon and because spikes can indicate extraordinary processes, volcanic, impact-related, or anthropogenic. But a spike alone is not a narrative. It is a data point demanding context. Core samples must be reproducible across transects. Dates must be cross-checked by radiocarbon and by stratigraphic correlation, and taponomic processes must be considered. In some locales, platinum anomalies correlate with significant environmental disturbance. In others, the signal dissolves into the background of routine depositional variation. The hypothesis that a single cosmic event precipitated the collapse of particular Bronze Age polities must therefore meet a high evidentiary bar. Consistent isotopic signatures, synchronous radiometric dates, and plausible mechanisms linking environmental shock to societal failure. This methodical insistence is not a refusal to tell a gripping story. It is, rather, the guardrail that keeps narrative from becoming propaganda. Consider the Last King motif. It works as metaphor because it condenses into a figure the anxieties of rulers who must answer for drought, salinity, or a failed irrigation headworks. Kingship in Mesopotamia was performative and liturgical as much as it was administrative. A king could be praised for restoring a canal. He could be cursed when the dikes failed. The last king who presides over the terminal phase of a polity embodies a political theology where divine favor is tied to hydraulic success.
It is a powerful emblem that translates readily into modern anxieties about stewardship and ecological crisis. Yet, while the empirical track must insist on method, the imaginative track is not to be dismissed. When a scribe, fingers stained with clay and ink, presses the reed into damp tablet to fix a lament for the city, there is creativity at work. Creativity that shapes communal memory. It is in this small workaday art that we find the cultural technologies that made continuity possible. The ability to transform crisis into song, complaint into petition, and memory into instruction. Such acts are not less historical than canal remains or core samples. They are complementary evidence of how people lived through environmental perturbations. From a human vantage, the tablets point us toward lives of measured scarcity and brilliant resilience. Imagine a shoemaker in Uruk whose work is recorded not in a singable hymn, but in a ration list. Across a courtyard, a seal cutter lifts his burin to slide an image, a gazelle, a star, a stylized boat, into the soft cylinder stone. That seal will travel with goods, securing transactions that keep the city's economy flowing. These small, often anonymous actions form the material backbone of what later generations would recall in mythic terms as the acts of gods. There are moments in the text that invite closer, almost forensic reading.
A passage where the gods dredged the bed can be understood two ways: as a mythic image of cosmic maintenance and as testimony to real canal works requiring specialized crews. A lament that the city is like woman bereft encodes gendered idioms of loss. It does not itself disclose a technological secret. The Atrahasis flood, finally, reads in some lines as a narrative of divine recalibration, an administrative reset more than a wholesale program of annihilation. The survivor story motifs, boat building, secrecy, bargain, speak to social memory after catastrophe, a memory that preserves the mechanics of survival, how to store grain, where to find high ground, without necessarily preserving intact explanations in the scientific sense. Comparative linguistics is where many speculative constructions begin to fray. Words that Sitchin renders as technical terms for metal operations or celestial engineering often have demonstrable cognates in neighboring dialects that carry ritual or administrative senses. When one surveys the corpus across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Old Babylonian texts, patterns emerge that favor ritualized metaphor and bureaucratic practice over high-tech literalism. That pattern does not preclude technological sophistication. It merely places that sophistication in the realm of hydraulics, metallurgy, textiles, and temple architecture, the observable, grittier domain of craft. On the field side, the sedimentologists and geochemists attempt to anchor myth to earth.
Drill cores taken from alluvial plains reveal pulses of deposition, oxidized horizons, and sometimes abrupt increases in organic content. But translating those signals into singular causes, an impact, a comet, a massive firestorm, requires careful cross-disciplinary work. A spike in platinum must be seen alongside pollen records, faunal shifts, changes in human diet inferred from isotope studies, and settlement abandonment patterns. Only when such signals align is the argument for sudden, society-altering event plausible. There remains, importantly, the social history of scholarly reception. Sitchin's work did not circulate in a vacuum. It traveled through late 20th century media ecologies, hungry for origin stories and for dramatic causalities. His interpretations found receptive audiences precisely because they offered a transgressive narrative that relocated human origins into a grander cosmic stage. That dynamism is itself a subject of study. It shows how modern publics appropriate ancient text for identity, fear, and wonder. Folklorists, media historians, and sociologists can map the channels by which a particular reading of Atrahasis morphs into a popular myth about external creators and lost kings. But the tablets themselves remain stubbornly material. In a dim room in a university collection, a tray of tablets waits, edges smoothed by centuries, finger marks frozen in clay, the impressed and corrected lines of a scribe at work. One of them contains a repeated formula about the allocation of brickmakers for riverbank repair. The tablet is not enthralling as cosmic revelation. It is enthralling as proof of an economy that calculated labor, allocated rations, and scheduled repairs with an almost modern bureaucratic competence. That mundane proficiency is, in its way, awe-inspiring. And yet, for the human imagination, the figure of a last Anunnaki king persists because it performs a psychological labor the tablets themselves demonstrate: the attempt to reconcile human contingency with meaningful order. In the myths, kings stand where gods recede, caretakers of a fragile covenant between people and the environment. When irrigation fails, the metaphor of a king lamenting is an ideological mechanism that channels blame and responsibility, ritual and reform. The difficulty for modern interpreters is to hold both senses together.
To read myth as social instrument and as repository of creative imagination without collapsing one into the other. To proceed, then, is to do two things at once. First, parse, carefully, relentlessly, the lines of atrahasis that describe labor, birth, and flood. Annotate possible semantic ranges, cite parallel usages, and identify where modern linguistic judgment tips into speculation.
Second, hold those readings against the hard data of cores, dates, and material culture. Where do sedimentary interruptions coincide with abandonment patterns? Where do ration lists stop, and is that stoppage synchronous with geological signals? Alongside these methods, map the reception genealogy. How did late 20th century authors translate associative flashes into grand claims? And how did popular media amplify them? Before taking up each tablet in sequence, let us return briefly and vividly to the people's perspective. Picture a river bending westward under a pale sun. A family stands on its bank where yesterday the path was firm and the mud had been clay for a potter. Children look toward the far field where reeds once were thick. Now pools of fresh water stand where only barley should be. The father, whose name will not be recorded on any monument, holds a tablet that lists his household rations. In the margin, the scribe has left a correction, a smaller measure for barley than before. The household will adapt, shift to summer fallow, trade hides instead of grain, send a son to the city for seasonal work. Those adjustments do not form a narrative as noble as a king's lament, but they are the practical story that underlies any mythic compression. From this vantage, we can begin the line-by-line work with Atrahasis Tablet 1, identifying the verbs of assignment, cataloging the divine names, and separating formulaic lament from procedural description. We will mark contested terms and present the alternative readings alongside their philological justifications. Then, when we turn from philology to the core record, we will place those textual layers beside bore samples, isotope tables, and settlement surveys, so that clay and core speak to one another across millennia. But first, the scribe dips his reed, pauses, and presses anew. The clay takes the mark. The line reads today as it did then, a petition, a plan, a line in a larger ledger. We take up that mark and trace its possible meanings with the care the object deserves. Tablet 1 opens, in most editions, with creation framed as assignment. The gods deliberate. Beings are apportioned tasks. Numbers are set. Our first task is not to repeat those sweeping sentences, but to ask with philological steadiness what the verbs actually do in the clause. Does the verb in line 3 mark an order issued by a god, or a repeated administrative formula applied to households? Is the object the people generally, men in the epic sense, or a narrower class, brickmakers, field workers, boatmen, whose names the administrative scribes would have noted elsewhere? To answer requires zooming in along 3 axes at once: morphology, context, and comparative corpus. Morphology is the most granular. The sign cluster that looks like a causative may instead be a prefixed stative. An apparent plural suffix may turn out to be a distributive particle. Each choice cascades.
Read as causative, a line yields divine volition. The god causes labor. Read as stative, the same line may simply record an ongoing condition, labor already in place. Context helps bracket those options. If the line sits alongside ration lists and numerical entries, the administrative reading gains weight. If it appears amid lament responses and invocatory phrases, the performative, theological reading becomes more plausible. Comparative corpus is the referee. Similar constructions in law codes, in temple lists, in contemporary myths tip the balance. Take, for example, one passage where the assignation of work follows an invocation of the mother god. Editions differ. Some punctuate the sequence as liturgy followed by assignment. Others amend a damaged sign to make the sequence administrative. He fixed the ration, rather than liturgical. He fixed the fate. This divergence has methodological consequences. If the authorial voice slips from ritual into ledger, the poem participates in a literary strategy that blurs bureaucracy and the sacred. Temple economies are not separate from the world of gods, but coextensive with it. If, on the other hand, the passage is purely ritual, then the poem's goal is to sacralize the order of labor, rather than document it.
The lament formulas, phrases that open with an interjection and a vocative, are themselves composite devices. Some operate as performative and are likely to have accompanied ritual recitation, perhaps even in prayer houses that doubled as administrative centers. Others are literary tropes inserted by a poet to universalize a localized complaint. We must therefore separate the formulaic kernel, words repeated across tablets and sites, from the poet's hand, the latter marked by metaphor, variation, and occasional flourish. Where the lament overlaps with administrative notation, the poet is not simply borrowing bureaucratic language for rhetorical effect. The language of allocation is already rhetorical, carrying social authority. When a lament invokes the mouths of the city and a ration list registers ex gur to the house, the two discourses articulate the same social performance. Measured provision as the metric of divine favor and civic stability. Philology, however, must remain anchored in materiality. Tablet I's broken lines are not empty gaps to be filled by imagination. They are loci where archaeologists and natural scientists can speak. In the stratigraphic record, we look for concordances. A notable hiatus in ration entries, followed by a sudden spike in migrations recorded elsewhere, could correspond to an environmental shock preserved in a core. Bore samples from the adjacent alluvial plain, when subjected to grain size analysis and oxygen isotope studies, often reveal an increase in coarse silts coinciding with decreased organic matter, signatures of sudden flood events, or alternately, of channel migration. Where these data line up with a stop in ration lists, a pattern emerges that supports the literal reading. People left fields, the temple stopped distributing barley in regular amounts, the scribe marked the change with an adjusted numeral. Yet concordance is rarely neat. A core's composition can be affected by local engineering, bank reinforcement, canal diversion that leave geological signatures indistinguishable from climate-driven shifts. Settlement surveys might show house abandonment without total desertion. A site may shrink rather than vanish. Here, the close reading of the tablet's paratext, marginal notations, colophons that list the scribe's name or the year name, becomes essential. A colophon that dates a table to the month of the great water or to the year of the king's canal provides a chronological hinge between text and sediment. Finding that hinge is the work of patience. Correlating paleoclimate series, dendrochronologies when available, and radiocarbon ranges to generate a probabilistic timeline. Fieldwork offers cautionary episodes. A core taken at the presumed site of an abandonment may show continuity. A core taken a kilometer away may show interruption. Human life in the floodplain is heterogeneous. Households adapt locally, draw on kinship networks, and trade.
Uma família pode enviar filho habilidoso à cidade, enquanto outra fica a reparar as diques. A Atrahasis poeta telescopia esses decisões em paradigmas, compressando múltiplas micro-histórias em símbolo emblemático arco. Esta é o poder e a frustração para o historiador. Ele shapea multiplicidade em mítica narrativa. Recepção histórica é parte da história zatervida. No late 20th century, certos autores populares traduziram os Anunnaki não como agentes culturais de metáforas agriculturais, mas como visitantes de Beyond the Planet, beings com tecnologia provis que engenheiraram humanidade e deixaram monumentos. A pública apetite por tais cosmologias, Spacefaring Architects of Civilization, foi feita por leituras seletivas. As anotações cuidadosas de escolas about metaphor and ritual foram flatenadas em claims de literal genetic manipulation. Fotografias de cilindrocelos e relevos, estriptas de escala e contexto, foram reinterpretadas como cenas de astronáutica intervenção. O escolar protesto, dizendo que winged figures são simbólicos, que a textual voz é teológica, não técnica, raramente penetrou as populares recontações que preferiam grande causalidade over messy contingency. Por que esta reinterpretação persiste? Parte da resposta está em psicologia. Os humanos buscam intencionalidade na face de vulnerabilidade. Uma cheia que destrói uma colheita é menos terrorífica se pode ser explicada como o efeito de um caprichoso Deus ou a interferência de um supernal engenheiro. Mitos que atribuam agência a um last king, seja divino ou alienígena, servem para localizar culpa e para sugerir remédios, movendo além de pessoal misfortuna para estrutural correção. As tablets de Atrahasis, em seu burocrático especificidade, registram decisões e falhas. Os Anunnaki mito resolve-os em uma tídia teleologia. A historiador's job é manter ambas verdades sem colapsá-las. Back at the table, the textual work proceeds line by line. We mark lacuna with a conservative hand, brackets for sure loss, dots for suspected letters, italics for conjecture. We eschew fanciful emendations that serve narrative ends rather than philological plausibility. When a critical line offers two readings, one that yields a theodicy and another that yields a ration, we weigh parallel vocabulary in contemporaneous economic texts. If the rare sign cluster occurs in a commerce ledger with a clear meaning, the administrative reading gains precedence. If it occurs mainly in poetic inscriptions, we tread toward metaphoric interpretation. Each determination is annotated, footnoted, cross-referenced. Iluminador momento vem quando atendemos a kinship fórmulas em tablet I. Uma linha que muitas traduções leem como um geral day multiplied pode ser também lida como um termo técnico para household expansion usado em documentos de transferência de terra. A diferença é palpável.
Read as general multiplication, the line contributes to the poem's account of human overpopulation as a narrative cause of the god's displeasure. Read as a legal term, the same line indexes demographic pressure in property relations, land subdivided, households fragmenting, new labor demands on diminished plots. The poem may be doing both, harnessing legal language to dramatize social reality. Recognizing this double register clarifies why the poet's outrage feels so administrative. Violation of norms about land and labor carries cosmic weight. Physical handling of tablets confirms the double register. Finger smudges on certain passages suggest repetition in recitation. These lines were touched more often, perhaps in liturgical performance. Conversely, erasures in quantitative sections indicate active use. Someone updated figures as supplies changed. The material palimpsest therefore mirrors the textual hybridity. Poetic lines bear the traces of ritual circulation. Numerical registers bear the marks of economic practice. When we set Tablet 1 beside the early 19th century survey data, rare maps, traveler accounts, and later excavation finds, we are sometimes startled by continuities. Certain place names persist, shifted phonetically into later periods. A site that the poem singles out as a major grain store still bears, 3 millennia later, soil anomalies consistent with prolonged cultivation.
Yet the temptation to draw linear genealogies from poem to present must be resisted. Cultural memory is partial and selective. Names can migrate, sediments can be redeposited. Methodologically, our working protocol becomes clear. For each contested line, we will produce a diplomatic transcription of the surviving signs, noting ligatures and variant graphetics. Provide a critical apparatus that records all significant readings from major editions. Offer a translation that is provisional, explicitly signaling conjectural restorations. Provide commentary that weighs morphological evidence, parallels, and implications for social practice. Cross-reference the translation with environmental and archaeological data, maps, cores, radiocarbon ranges to propose temporal and causal synchronies. Only after this careful triangulation can we propose narratives that avoid both the reductive literalism of sensational receptions and the sterile dismissal of myth as mere fiction. We attempt such a triangulation now on a cluster of lines midway through Tablet I. The passage in question strings together 3 acts: the assignment of brickmaking, the notation of a reduced barley ration, and a sudden lacuna that many editors emend to murmur or lament. In the physical tablet, the lacuna covers 3 signs. The left fragment suggests the end of a verb. 3 modern editors diverge. Editor A reads the passage as "the laborers grumbled," reading the verb in a vocalic stem that marks complaint.
By inputting all attested occurrences of a problematic cluster across the corpus, we can visualize frequency distributions, how often the cluster appears in administrative contexts versus ritual ones. Such quantification does not replace close reading, but it rectifies the naive tendency to let a single evocative parallel dominate interpretation. Where a cluster appears predominantly in economic lists, a literary gloss loses momentum. Where it is evenly distributed, equivocation is warranted. Discussion returns inevitably to the human scale. The poet of Atrahasis may have issued dire pronouncements about the multiplication of humans and the gods' response, but the ledger entries remind us that the poem's actors were concrete, named households, specific rations, and measurable labor quotas. The father on the riverbank negotiates that interface every season. He reads the tablet, counts on the scribe's corrections to forecast next month's allotment, and recalibrates his family's choices. Leave a field fallow, sell a flock, send a child to the city. Those micro-decisions accumulate into migration patterns, which leave traces in both archaeology and the poem. So we proceed, reading Tablet 1 aloud in the dim room, syllable by syllable, watching how the clay catches breath. A student at the table taps a sequence and calls attention to a rare sign. We compare it to a photograph of a comparable sign from another site. The camera's resolution reveals a ligature invisible to the naked eye. The ligature decides the verb's stem. The student, exhilarated, proposes an amendment that shifts agency from a god to a human steward. We argue, quietly enough to keep the reverence of the object intact. The amendment, if accepted, will alter the clause's moral economy. Responsibility moves from the sky to the house. That debate is instructive because it displays the chain that links philology to interpretation and interpretation to public meaning. One modest emendation can become a torrent. It reframes a motif and, in the hands of a popularizer, becomes a headline about ancient kings, gods, or aliens. The scholar's duty is thus double: to be exacting in the labors of transcription and vigilant about the speculative steps that move from text to narrative. For now, the day's work ends with a set of provisional readings and an inventory of lacunae to be revisited. We pack the photographs, record the variants, and set aside the tablets until fresh light returns. Outside, the modern river slips by, indifferent to our divisions. Inside, the clay rests, a repository of measurement, lament, and the hum of everyday life.
In the morning, we will take Tablet 2, where the flood narrative gathers force and where the boundary between administrative record and divine act becomes even more fraught.